Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rima's conversation on Muslim diversity. My name is Farouk, the research analyst for Rima, and I will be the moderator for the session this evening. Now, before we begin, allow me to share the context for this session. It is basically an attempt to uncover the multifaceted nature of Islam in Singapore, and to better understand these issues, Rima will be conducting virtual discussions over three main themes. Firstly, on religious orientations of Muslims in Singapore. Secondly, on intra-faith relations. And finally, on Muslim identities and society. Now, these themes were basically chosen to reflect the everyday lived reality of diversity experienced by Muslims in Singapore. It will also look at how global trends and modernity affect Muslim diversity in Singapore. We hope that these discussions would raise the level of public discourse by introducing scholars and practitioners working on Muslim diversity to the broad public through our social media platforms. Now, for our first session, we had uh, we had the opportunity basically to engage with a prominent speaker that we all know, Dr. Wali Jumlat, to speak on his recent book, Islam in a Secular State. And if you miss out on that session, you can watch it through our Instagram, Rima_Singapore. That is our Instagram handle. Now, if you have not followed it, please do follow it, and you can catch it online, because if you're an activist, or someone who's interested in understanding state society relations, that is definitely a session that you do not want to miss out on. So, for tonight's session, we are delighted to have with us two youthful and bright scholars to discuss their insightful paper on contemporary Salafism in Singapore. The discussion aims to explore the current landscape of Salafism in Singapore, as well as the extent to which local contemporary Salafis find their ideas acceptable in Singapore's present context. Now, allow me to share the flow of the program for tonight. Our speakers will first present their respective parts, followed by a set of questions by yours truly. We'll then leave the last 30, 40 minutes, depending on where we are, for questions from our live viewers. Now, just a gentle reminder to stick to the subject matter when asking questions. So let us proceed to the speaker or an introduction of the speakers for tonight. Our first speaker is Mr. Haziq Jani, a senior analyst, research analyst at the Studies in Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies, or the SRP program at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or better known as RSIS. His research interests include Islamism and political violence. Now, accompanying him is Ustad Said Huzaifa Al-Kaf, who is an associate research fellow at the Indonesia program at RSIS also. And his research interests include Middle Eastern and North African politics, political Islam, Islamic jurisprudence, and Islamist movements in Southeast Asia. Without further ado, I would like to welcome both Mr. Haziq and Mr. Huzaifa to begin their presentation. It is our pleasure to have the both of you with us. So please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Farooq, for having us here. We really want to thank Rima for inviting us to present our research. We are very pleased to share with all of you, and we hope that before we begin, we hope that you will be able to get three main takeaways from our presentation. The first is that Salafism is not monolithic. Salafis are a diverse community with different content emphases, different references for religious resources, and different networks of preachers and followers. The second is that the degree to which an individual Salafi is exclusivist or inclusivist is dependent on individual agency as well as structural constraints. And lastly, that state and society play an important role in moderating Salafi discourse as well as the broader Islamic discourse in Singapore. And as you may realize from our three main takeaways, this is not a witch hunting session of who is Salafi or who is not Salafi, but a mature conversation to learn more about Salafism in Singapore, particularly. So we'll start this discussion with our research objectives, or in other words, why we were interested in studying Salafism. Many of you may not remember, but there was a time when global news coverage focused on Islamist terrorism conducted by groups such as ISIS, Al Qaeda, and Jama'ah Islamiyah. This year marks the 20th anniversary since the GI arrest. So Singapore in particular places importance on harmony and social cohesion. So Salafism was thrust into the spotlight when individuals who happened to be Salafis were detained for radicalism or were barred from teaching. So between 2016 to 2017, there were few arrests of individuals who were affiliated with Salafism. For instance, a listener of Radio Hang, a Salafi radio station based in Batam. There was the first female Singaporean to be detained for radicalism under the Internal Security Act, who claimed she was looking for a Salafi or an Islamic State supporter to marry. And then later that month, Rasul Dahri was barred from teaching in Singapore on the basis that his teachings were exclusivist in nature. 9 of his books were banned. Singapore also banned books written by Salih Fauzan, a Saudi Salafi scholar. So although the Singapore government did not put the spotlight on Salafism, particularly as a problematic sect of Islam, these actions added on to the false assumption that Salafism was somehow linked to Jihadism. The second reason why we were interested in studying Salafism was there was tension centered on between Salafis and non-Salafis, centered on whose interpretation of religion was better or most right. These disagreements between Salafis and non-Salafis, whether at the religious elite level or among lay Muslims, tended to be on Tahlil, Maulid, and the visiting of graves. We are quite familiar with these disagreements, but especially around 2015 to 2017, when we were about to embark on this study, the tension between Salafis and non-Salafis in the world became pronounced, affecting even our religion. So public quarrels between religious elite in Malaysia, for instance, became borderline political. Maybe even we can just claim that it's political, involving even secular institutions, particularly because the securitization of Salafism during the heyday of ISIS escalated this tension. So we proceed to a brief definition of what Salafism is. So Salafism is a branch of Sunni Islam whose adherents claim to emulate the pious predecessors or a Salafus Salih, as closely and in as many spheres of life as possible. So Salafus Salih refers to the first three generations. We measure it first three after the death of the Prophet. So we commonly know them as Sahabat, Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. So to simplify the difference between Salafism and non-Salafism, what does it mean to emulate the first three generations of pious predecessors? Sunni Muslims also attach great importance to the action of the Prophet and his companions. However, they do not imitate them directly, but view them through the prism of the scholarly traditions. Salafis, however, exclusively and meticulously emulate the Salaf, the first three generations, rejecting all other source of influences such as opinions, consensus, and rationalism. So this is a simplification. So how about Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Wahab, etc.? They are not from the first three generations, right? So Salafis regard these scholars as people who they claim echo the opinions and practices of the Salaf. For them, the opinions, the consensus, and the rationalism of traditionalist scholars were a form of impurity in understanding Islamic religious resources. So, as a backdrop to our study, academic scholars would categorize Salafis into these three categories: quietist Salafism, political Salafism, and Jihadi Salafism, based on their respective emphases. Quietists, for instance, they shun political activism and concentrate on cleansing and teaching Islam in all its purity. However, despite the name Quietist Salafism, their political voice is loud. Political Salafism emphasized on political commitment as an integral part of Islam through contentious debates, parliamentary participation, and founding political parties. Jihadi Salafism, they aim to overthrow supposedly apostate regimes in the Muslim world through violent means. So this was the academic paradigm of Salafism at the moment, especially when they focused on Saudi Salafism. Were the works that we reviewed prior to the commencement of our research. So again, there are various categories that don't seem to fit Salafism in Singapore. Quietists, political jihadists, purists, Haraki, Madkhali, Sururi, Maqdisi. These categories don't seem to explain Salafism as we see in Singapore, at least perfectly. We also looked at Salafism in Indonesia through the works of scholars in Indonesia such as Nur Hadi Hassan, Din Wahid, Sunan Wuto. They looked at the madrasas and madaris in Indonesia. They looked at networks of Salafis in Indonesia and Salafi radio stations, as well as other books that looked at Singapore and touched on some aspects of Salafism. For instance, Dr. Khairuddin Al-Junaid, he looked at madrasas in Singapore as well as the other Muhammadiyah in Singapore. There was also reference to Salafism in the past because they have been around in Singapore for a long time, contrary to common understanding. So the works of Stafford Raffles, Hooker, Rolfe, they reference Salafism in some way or another, but they do not really explain how Salafism in Singapore came about or what it actually looked like. There has been basically no study of Salafism per se in Singapore. So we wanted to uncover deeper meanings behind the term Salafism and the practice of Salafis in Singapore. This topic is actually quite sensitive because there is, like we said in the background, there is actually a demonization of Salafis among those who we see as anti-Salafis. Salafis are also a numerically small community, so we needed to have a qualitative study and we needed to choose interviewees who were better able to provide substantive answers. What exactly was our research question? We wanted to know how contemporary Salafis interpret and practice Salafism in Singapore. We were aware of the scholarly categorizations that we mentioned earlier, and some of our interviewees were actually aware of these categories as well. These three categories are, as we said, incongruent to reality. Some of our interviewees would not agree to be categorized as such. Through our research, we were able to understand the structural limitations of Salafism in Singapore and how individual Salafis deal with reality. So to understand where our research question comes in is actually is actually where Salafi theology, belief, and their rituals and action are translated into reality. We are not really discussing whether their theology or belief is correct or wrong and evaluating it. We are just looking at how these beliefs are translated to reality. This is the framework because we know that it's difficult to categorize Salafis in Singapore. We adopted a framework to understand their ideas and positions on issues important to the Singapore context. The individuals were placed on a continuum of opposing religious opinions from soft to strong. Opinion 1 versus opinion 2, for example, exclusivist versus inclusivist. A strong position would suggest active support of the opinion and advocacy beyond the individual level, whereas a soft position would suggest merely subscribing to an opinion at the individual level. And these were the issues that our interviews were carried on. Progressive versus reactionary deals with response to modernity. Reactionary would mean trying to emulate the Salaf in the early days in the concrete form, meaning reviving and re-establishing old institutions. Progressive, however, means advocating for advancement of education, science, modern technology, etc., aligned with the values of the Salaf. Inclusivist refers to, for instance, despite believing that Islam is the one true religion, Salafis may also believe that all humans are equally creations of God, regardless of belief, and that their beliefs may have some truths. Exclusivists, however, are unopen to recognizing human dignity of the religious other, and they lack in respect and may even dehumanize a religious other. Likewise, emulation of local versus Arab culture. Some Salafis accept local cultural practices, while others advocate emulating the Arab culture of the Salaf, things like clothing and other cultural artifacts with religious basis. Other issues include political stances towards the West, jurisprudential issues pertaining to rituals, and theological issues, for example, who is a Muslim and what is the nature of God, etc. Okay, now I will let Huzaifa elaborate on the rest of our research.
Okay, so like my colleague shared earlier on the individuals that we interviewed. So why we choose these 10 individuals? Because we wanted to know what exactly is Salafism in Singapore, which is why we selected people for our interviews who are able to explain Salafism to us, not just people who claim they are Salafi, but they cannot explain their beliefs fairly. So these 10 key personalities are in our paper, and we provided further identifiers in our paper. These are just some of the summary that we highlighted in this slide. And they are all significant members and are representative of Salafi communities in Singapore. And then we supplemented our research with additional content analysis of these sources from, for example, the magazine, social media, blog posting, others. And we also conducted informal interviews with madrasas, former madrasa background students, or even historical fact-checking. So if we look at the timeline of development of Salafism in Singapore, we can see that Salafism existed in Singapore since the 1900s. Its roots are modernist and progressive. However, it was affected by Middle East geopolitical turmoil, particularly Iranian Revolution, that resulted in anti-Shiite sentiments, and Western foreign policy in the Middle East that resulted in anti-West ideas. And from 2000 onwards, Salafism in Singapore started to have a theological emphasis in their discourse. This was the period when the idea of takfir was revived by some Salafi scholars in the Middle East to legitimize the killing of the Westerners and Shiites. So in our interviews, we identified key components of the Salafi discourse. So the key identifier of a Salafi is the Tauhid Tiga, is the main characteristic of Salafis in Singapore and in general. So to highlight here, Tauhid Tiga is different from the Tiga Serangkai. Tiga Serangkai is a body of knowledge which includes Tauhid, Fiqh and Tasawuf, whereby Tauhid Tiga is about the belief system of the Salafis. And these are some of the key issues of contentions between Salafis and the non-Salafis in jurisprudence or fiqh, and also in theology or the Aqidah discourse. So we can see the contestation between the kaum muda versus kaum tua, the issue of sifat 20 versus Tauhid 3, or even between the idea of being Salafi versus the being traditionalist, and the idea about or the idea about the understanding of Tauhid al-Asma wa sifat. Tauhid Asma wa Sifat, which is the belief in the Supreme Being's names and attributes. So, through our interviews also, we found a range of Salafi networks and circles as listed here. Mamlaka alumni here refers to the students who studied in Saudi Arabia. There are also those who do not want to be labeled as Salafi, therefore we put there as a no label Salafis. But at the same time, apart from our interviewees, there is also a loose community of lay Salafis who were introduced to Salafism through the global physical and online religious education industry and other commercial entities. So if we were to focus on main groups, these three are the main ones, but they are not cohesive. What we meant by not cohesive in the sense that you cannot find like an organization called themselves as modernist Salafis. No, so yeah, so it's like a loose individuals, but they all share the same. We can put them into the same category, which is, for example, the modernist Salafis. And of course, Muhammadiyah, you can find it as an organization, and also the Mamlaka alumni. But also within Mamlaka alumni, we found out there are actually different set of individuals who can be categorized as inclusivists at the same time as well as quieties. So apart from groupings, ideas, we found that there are elements that impact the individual. First, in terms of inclusivism and exclusivism, interviewees with madrasah background tended to be on the inclusivist end of the continuum. Some interviewees suggested that a strict or fiery personality were likely to be exclusivist. However, this assumption deserves another study. And also some scholars of sociology of religion point to individual psychology to explain why some individuals lean towards religious teachings that propound exclusivism or violence. Meaning to say, it's not because of the teachings itself, but also because of the psychological or sociological aspect of that person. Similarly, our interviewees shared that their personal experience in living in Singapore and engaging in plural society has made them realize that exclusivist ideas were irrelevant to them. Our interviewees also shared that exclusivism was not taught in their educational curriculum. However, they shared some of the exclusivist Salafis pick up exclusivist ideas from halaqah or religious sessions outside of their schools. These findings also seem to apply to Salafi political views. They suggested that Rasul Dahri is a prominent Salafi who promoted anti-West, anti-democratic, and anti-secular political views. So in summary, exclusivism is dampened by individual choice in selecting Salafi ideas to fit the Singapore context, as well as exposure and guidance. So these are the features of Salafi educational institutions in Singapore. They teach usul salasa, and in some instances, they will softly try to counter the Ash'ari theology. As for the teachers, there are institutions that hire both Salafis and non-Salafis. However, non-Salafi teachers are not expected to follow the Salafi curriculum strictly. There are also institutions who only hire Salafis. So as an update to our research, Islamic educational institutions and its teachers have to adhere to the current MUIS framework that governs religious education in Singapore. So for instance, under the IECP or Islamic Education Centers and Providers, the institutions are expected to submit their curriculum for MUIS to review. MUIS are quite open to Salafi curriculum, except where there are exclusivist teachings. I think it's not only the Salafi, but also the non-Salafi curriculum as well. So all Asatiza have to adhere to the ARS Code of Conduct, which does not tolerate exclusivism. As we know, there are some schools which have closed and some teachers whose ARS have been cancelled. I think that's all from us with regards to the presentation. Can I pass back to Ustaz Farouk?
Thank you. Both Haziq and Huzaifa. I guess the discussion is a summary of the paper, and if let's say you want to know more about the presentation, I invite you to read the paper. And if you don't have any access, maybe you can contact them directly, and they can help you with it. But I guess there are many pointers from the discussion that we can discuss and engage further. But what I particularly appreciate is the fact that from the discussion and from reading the paper itself, it forces us to avoid painting a group of people with the same brush. Now, this typecasting is particularly not helpful in appreciating the myriad meanings of identity to a person. Now, we need to also mobilize our collective capacity to think in an alternative way that can accept the nuances that you have pointed out, and not one that forces us to see things in binaries. I guess Salafism, just like any other movements, right, and orientations, should not be seen as a monolith, like what Haziq mentioned, but it should be viewed as a continuum, which you guys rightly pointed out. Now, it also cannot be disconnected with social, political, and historical realities that have shaped the different trajectories within the movement itself. To put it simply, what I really like the paper allows Salafis to define themselves based on their own terms and what they stand for rather than who they are not. And as a researcher, I deeply appreciate that, although I honestly believe that there is space to move beyond this or such labelings or such cleavages, and read our identities through intersectionality. In that sense, when we share in that sense, basically we share something in common with almost everyone else, and we see that across the Salafi movement, where there are certain elements or aspects that overlaps with the so-called non-Salafis. And that is something that I really appreciate. Anyway, that is for a separate discussion. So let us move to the question and answers. So before I begin with I have my own set of questions. But before I begin with my questions, just a reminder, if you have any questions for our live viewers, you have any questions, you can just write it down and upload it on our comment, and we will pull out the questions and raise it to the speakers. And also a reminder to stick to the subject matter and the discussion. So I guess my first question would be, just like how we begin our conversations previously, how do you position your paper or the discussion itself within the larger scholarship on Salafism? Like, what are the similarities and differences? Any one of you or both of you can answer that.
So basically, research on Salafism is keen to understand, before our study, keen to understand the different political standings of the different groups of Salafis, because it has to do with political action, which when taken to the extreme leads to political violence. So they are looking at qualities, people who are not keen on politics at all. And this is not just something that is particular to Salafism. We see that as well in other Islamic sects as well. So they are not political, or they don't participate in politics in, for example, in Saudi Arabia, because there is a particular political framework there. You can't have political parties and so on and so forth. There are certain rules to adhere to over there when it comes to political participation. This political framework in Saudi Arabia does not apply to Singapore. Same goes for example, political Salafis, for politicos, or some people call them hierarchies. who formed political parties in Egypt, in Tunisia, Algeria. The same goes. This does not seem to apply to Singapore. And then we have finally the jihadi Salafis. So that is their concern. Our paper, we seek to actually learn more about Salafis in how they practice their beliefs in their daily lives, which is something more relevant to us in Singapore. Because if you look at these three categories, if I'm talking about political action, political ideas, we are not always thinking about that in Singapore, and certainly not in the same terms, certainly not in the same frame of mind as Salafis around the world. There are also studies of Salafism that is closer to home. For example, Salafis in Indonesia and Malaysia, and over there there are studies on schools and so on. But again, certain things are not congruent to life in Singapore. There is no, for example, a strictly Salafi school, which is clear, like my colleague explained earlier. No, there are non-Salafis teaching in schools that are labeled as Salafis. In Indonesia, for example, it's very clear if the school is Salafi. I think in the Philippines as well, it will be named after imams that are part of the Salafi tradition. So we want to give that context to that kind of we want to uncover the meanings of Salafism in Singapore, and it's particularly because of the misconceptions of Salafism. The misconceptions is because we are only looking at Salafism through this academic research of foreign context by foreigners, but we need to study ourselves as well. So that's where our research is placed. Zaifa, you want to add anything else?
Thank you, Aziz. I think, my colleague has shared, I think, more or less about it. But I think what I want to highlight here is that, okay, so like when we started our paper, it's more or less because of the instances or incidences that happened during that period. For example, jihadism, terrorism. So we want to, and then when we look at scholarly work, often than not, people or scholars would somehow link Salafism with jihadism and terrorism. And then so Salafism in that sense becomes an issue. And of course, we understand that in Singapore there are many Salafis, so that's why we want to know, is it really the same? Is it true that they are like that, or they are whoever holds Salafi views, then they will become a terrorist one day? So that's where we want to try to find out, and that's where this research starts.
Thank you. So we have a few comments here from the public or from the viewers, from our live viewers. Maybe we can just pull out some. Maybe for a start, I think there's a clarification that is required, like from you guys. Like, what do you mean by teaching fiqh Shafi'i through the Salafi lens? And secondly, if you can also add on to that, maybe very briefly, like, what is the difference between Wahhabism and Salafism?
So I start with the second one or first one first? Okay, I think I start with the second one first. Okay?
Yeah.
So, okay, from our research, right? So if you look at Salafism and Wahhabism, okay, so scholarly articles would put Wahhabism as those who are associated with the Ibn Wahhab's teachings or ideas, whereby Salafism is broader than that. So in our paper, we can understand that Salafism includes those modernists from the 1900s, or from the 1900s until today. So when we label somebody as a Singapore Salafist, they are not necessarily Wahhabis. They are also the modernists. So in that sense, in terms of scholarly understanding, Salafi is broader than Wahhabi. Wahhabi is focused on the those who believe or embrace Ibn Wahhab's ideas or teachings, whereby Salafi is broader than that, which includes the modernists also. And modernists, for example, the idea from the Rashid Redha or Muhammad Abdul or Afghani and individuals during that period. And they are not included, or they are not being put under the Wahhabi banner.
Mhm. Okay. I guess maybe if let's say I can ask or I can add on to that question, Haziq, you mentioned that. I mean, in the presentation itself, like Mamlaka alumni, I mean, most of them they return with Salafi manhaj and Akidah that are basically influenced by what is happening in Saudi, be it in terms of politics and also, a form of Saudi Salafism, and particularly the quieties among them, they don't really have. A charitable outlook of or attitude towards the West. But I guess if I can ask this question, like with the recent modernization efforts in Saudi, how does it impact their close affiliation with Saudi Salafism? Considering that there is a possibility that some of their teachers and scholars might support these reform efforts. I mean, does it really put them in a double bind, or do they find a way out? When they are back home in Singapore.
Yeah, I think since we did our study, there have been many changes in Saudi Arabia within the religious institutions, in society, what is allowed and not allowed. There are a lot of social reforms, political reforms, changes that really affect how Salafis in Saudi Arabia practice and their religion and so and preach to their followers and so on. I think very clearly in Saudi Arabia, if you are not following the mainstream approved Saudi form of Salafism, then I think by now you have been collected by the security forces over there, and you have been put through some interviews and so on.
Mhm.
So this pressure in Saudi Arabia somewhat affected Salafism in our part of the world as well, because in parallel, it's not just Saudi Arabia, the whole world became somewhat suspicious of Salafism, right? Like how we began the chapter. So there was securitization of Salafism in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and so a lot of Salafis clarified their ideas further. So, for instance, if I were to explain the different categories of whether or not one is a non-Muslim, I don't want to use the word. I mean, I just use the word lah. If I were to explain in public the different levels of the word kafir, it will be very uh, problematic, uh, particularly during that period of time. And so when people clarified their ideas in Indonesia, we see the prominent Salafi preachers actually talk about being more gracious, being more kind um, towards non-Muslims, because they didn't want to be seen as among the Salafis that the security forces should be concerned about, that authorities should be concerned about in Indonesia and in Malaysia. So that's one. On the other hand, we also see a hardening of Salafis who are perhaps more extreme in their views. So Salafis who are more extreme in their frame of mind would simply interpret the political developments as yes, as they have believed anyway. The political framework in Saudi Arabia is not the pure form of politics that they agree with, and therefore they are correct in their view that that these governments are among governments around Middle East, Muslim governments that are actually apostates and so on. There is a hardening of views, but because the group is smaller, we don't actually see it translating into directly translating into violence and so on. There are some moments, for example, there was the Pensacola shooting, not really related to ISIS, but he was listening to a lot of the hardline preachers in Saudi Arabia and became inspired to commit violence. And that was around the time of the Saudi reforms. Yeah.
Mhm.
Farouk, if I can add also, I think when we talk about what happened in the government level and also in the educational institutions, right? So from our interviews with the Salafis, because they are from the first batches to even until I think about early 2000s, so they shared with us that uh, to expose yourself to exclusivist Wahhabis or in a way Salafist teachings, right, in Saudi Arabia, it's not through the curriculum from the
Mhm.
university or from the schools, but you can get that more from the halakha session outside of the school. So technically, the school or the university will follow whatever curriculum that the government wanted. Right. So in that sense, if the government wants the university to promote its modernization efforts, I think the university will have to do that, and the students will learn about it also. But for the outside sessions, it's not controlled by the government. Right? So it's more of like, you have that freedom to teach whatever kind of you want. So for example, one of our interviewees, so he shared that he learned about al-wala wal-bara. It's not from the university, but actually it's outside of the university, which is, I mean, it's one of the concept that is famous in Salafism. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I guess that is also a very important point to highlight that not many of us know unless we really study about it. I guess you mentioned the word exclusivism, and there's a lot of discussion on this, not just on your paper, but in general concerning the subject matter. Maybe you'd like to clarify. A comment here from our public fikri. The term exclusivist. Does being exclusivist means not being open to the idea that there might be some truth in other religions based on your findings, if there is any? What does exclusivism means? Does it really mean that excluding everything?
Okay, so in our in our paper, we are looking at inclusivism and exclusivism in the sense of our attitudes towards the human value of the religious other, the value of that person based on him being a Muslim. So is I think it's unfair, for example, to paint Muslims as being negative or bad just because they don't believe that there's any truth in other religions, or in other words, only their religion is right and there's no other truths around the world. It's normal for not just for Muslims but also for people who of various other religions. They will also naturally think that they are right and so on. But those who are strongly inclusivists go beyond that. So strong inclusivists would recognize that there are some truths in other religions. They don't, and they will actually share that with others through their religious teachings and so on. So when we look at exclusivists, those who are strong exclusivists, we are talking about not just that I don't believe in a particular religion's practice or idea, but I'm also telling people that it is bad, and I'm painting it in a light that is beyond just religious difference. So for example, uh, people who for example, I may disagree with whether or not it's okay to say Merry Christmas. I think that's still safe in the Singapore context. I don't want to wish you Merry Christmas, but I'm okay with saying, okay, I hope you have a good holiday, something like that. So that one is maybe soft exclusivist. Strong exclusivist would be someone who will say, those who wish people Merry Christmas, this is very sensitive, but that they are going to hellfire, and so on. It nullifies their worth as a Muslim just because they mention Merry Christmas to someone else. So try to when we are using this when we were writing this paper, we needed to use these terms, inclusivism and exclusivism. But when we say exclusivist, we are just explaining this aspect of behavior. We are not saying that there is something wrong with you that I should call the authorities to report on you and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Azik, that, I think as a researcher, it is helpful for us to use such categorizations or put it in a continuum, whether one is soft exclusivist or strong exclusivist. But I guess the difficulty that comes with it is not necessarily how it is being conceived or how it is materialized on the ground. Right? When I look at someone as a Salafi, I don't necessarily see him as a strong or soft exclusivist. Right? When I refuse to wish someone a Merry Christmas, immediately I would be assumed to be a strong exclusivist, even though I am not. So that is a difficulty, right? And I may not necessarily be a Salafi, right? Um, we hold onto certain positions, and these positions are sometimes fluid. So how do we go about this? I mean, based on your engagement with them and based on your, your expertise.
So is it because uh, these issues such as inclusivism and exclusivism don't necessarily apply to just Salafism. It applies to all Islamic sects. Therefore, when we were talking to them, we had to ask them their views on this particular issue as one component of our evaluation of which particular group of Salafism they belong to and how they came about how these ideas came about. We are not really interested in evaluating that person whether he's inclusivist or exclusivist, but it was an important uh, part of our interview for us to know exactly where they got this idea from. Yeah. Zaifa, would
Mhm.
you like to add anything else?
I think is good for Haziq to explain. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, building on that, you also mentioned certain ideational frames, and you mentioned this repeatedly, not just in the discussion but also in the paper, and the need to distinguish, Salafi ideas from these ideational frames that may be adopted by both Salafi and non-Salafi movements, like you mentioned. So, could you perhaps explain? Um, what are these ideational frames and explain the significance of making that distinction?
Okay, so there are certain so ideational frames that we refer to actually refers to certain ideas that exist across all sects in Islam. So, for example, the idea that the idea of the creation or formation of an Islamic state, the necessity for it. It's not an idea that is unique to Salafis. The same goes, for example, uh, to to create a society that is governed and guided by Islamic law. We see among even secularist Muslims, among Muslims that are of Hanafi, Madkhali, Ash'ari leanings and so on, it's not something that is unique to Salafism. Other additional frame, for example, asserting that Islam is the solution to all of life's problems, politics, society, and so on. Again, it's not something that is unique to Islam. Blaming unique to Salafism, blaming Western values and practices for a variety of social ills. Asserting that regimes are merely extensions of Western interests determined to weaken and control Muslim societies. You will find it among conspiracy theories who also don't, who may not really fit into the category of Salafis in Singapore or anywhere. So we needed to separate these ideational frames from our research because it's not part of the Salafi tradition. Basically, we are only concerned with parts of their tradition, and we are trying to find out how their manhaj, which is referring to going back to returning to the Quran and Sunnah or returning to the practices of the pious predecessors, is translated into reality in Singapore.
Mhm. And but what can also attest that what is basically the common denominator between the different strains of Salafism is the attempt to purify Islam, right? To go back to Islam, which basically stems from their manhaj. And you mentioned the example of TBC. It's an acronym for Tahayyul, Bid'ah, and Khurafat, not forgetting the penetration of Western values that are deemed foreign to the tradition. However, how can we understand the rationale of maintaining the purity of Islamic thought? I mean, that is the first part. And what does it mean, and how does one go about it? Is it really possible to be disconnected from foreign influence, 100% a pure, pristine Islam?
Okay. Uh, so if you look at the the history of Salafism or the history of Islam itself. Okay, we don't go so far back, maybe about 100 years ago. There are many groups, non-Salafi groups, and Salafi groups also, that actually argue that, you know, the Muslim society are on the decay because of some external factors, whether be the Western colonialism, Western ideas, Western values, and whatnot. And also they look at it from an internal standpoint, whereby there are elements of what do you call it, like tahayul or irrational thinking, excessive spirituality that affect our religion. Therefore, to them, because I mean, they would argue that because of this, our societies or our religious values becomes decrease towards in this era. So probably may not be decreasing immediately, but, you know, slowly decrease into decay. So they would argue that okay, so because of these things, so therefore we need to change, right? So how do we need to change? We have to remove all these things. We really have to remove all these external factors and also internal factors. So that's why when we see the term like TBC, right, the Tahayul Bid'ah and Khurafat, it's all related to the be it excessive spiritualism or about the irrationality of Muslims embracing certain rituals in Islam. Like, you know, we think too much of, like, you know, all these excessive spiritual things or belief that affect our akidah or affect our religious ideas. So technically, when they will argue about that, people are convinced, yes, you know, we have too much of, you know, all these factors that affect our religion. Therefore, we need to purify it as per how the Prophet or the Sahabat or the Tabi'in religion back then was. So they want to, in a way, go back to that era. But that's where the difference comes when we talk. When my colleague Haziq shared with you about the diagram between the Salafis and Salafis. So the Salafis would want to so-called emulate meticulously and in an exact manner on how the three generations live their life as Muslims, whereby the non-Salafis would look at them from the prism of scholarly works. So because every era there will be scholars who talk or who explains or write or wrote about Islam and its religious ideas. So they will look at that and then embrace it through, and then you see the evolution of each religious ideas. So for example, if you look at Shafi'i today, right, the Shafi'i school of thought, do you think it's as exactly as Shafi'i school of thought as during the Shafi'i's time? I doubt so, because there are many opinions change because of the changing of time, circumstances, you know, and whatnot. So I think changes or developments in religion, somewhat we cannot reject it. It will happen. I mean, we have to embrace it no matter what. I mean, we couldn't insist on living like in the 7th century Arabia, whereby we are in the 21st century, or and whatnot. Yeah.
That is a fair point. Maybe we can just select a couple of questions from our viewers. First question is from Izhar Rahman. I mean, he has two questions. Okay, so his first question is: will quietist Salafism, such as Damaj Salafism of Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wadi', be an effective counter to Jihadi Salafism, or does it inadvertently enable Jihadi Salafism? I guess we'll stick with that first question first.
Okay, so I think one of the lessons from our study is that we shouldn't be confident in the safety of any particular assigning safety to any particular sect of Islam from being involved in political violence that maybe is something of concern to the respective societies or communities that we belong to. In Singapore, it goes to us. Like from the start, I think we quite clearly stated that it doesn't mean that you are Salafi, you are going to be a jihadi. It's not so straightforward like that. In fact, it's nothing to do with your particular set of beliefs. And I think that same argument goes to particular sects within Salafism. It could be Saudi Salafism one day. It could be Quietist another. I want to highlight the nuance. For example, in Quietist Salafism, it is Quietist only in the Saudi context because
Mhm.
they refuse to participate in politics. But there's also an element of support of the political framework in Saudi Arabia, which is why it is the favored component or section of Salafism in Saudi Arabia. But if you were to plug them out of their context and put them in another place, the same pattern of behavior of translating their views into action may not happen in another context. And
Mhm.
it's not easy for us to argue if certain forms of Salafism will be a counter to jihadi Salafism, or whether or not it enables jihadi Salafism, because it's not like a factory, like you go inside, you
Yeah.
learn certain ideas, and then you go out. There are a lot of steps before somebody actually joins jihadist terrorist groups or
Mhm.
believes in certain ideas that are shared by by jihadi Salafism. It ranges from personal psychology to their own associations with individuals and so on. So there's a separate set of research on this. And
Mhm.
the same goes, for example, to people who believe that Sufism is not going to lead you into political violence. When given the right context, the right people who are considered so-called Sufis talking to you, uh, you that particular group may even lead to political violence. So I just want to, we may not remember this, but there was a point of time where there was this group in Malaysia called Al Mauna, and they are definitely not Salafis, neither or linked to any form of Salafism. They are more a spiritual group. They believe that they have some form of human, what do you call this? They like Superman, they put their hands inside oil and they are safe and so on. So there's this kind of spiritual beliefs. But yet they were involved in political violence and they were of concern to the Malaysian government. So although we are looking at political violence, as in this research is somewhat applicable to the field of political violence, is we are not looking at, for example, if somebody is jihadist or not. We are not saying that any form of Salafism is linked to jihadism.
Mhm. Thanks, Haziq. I mean, I guess before I proceed to his next question, right? I mean, allow me to just jump in. Like, you mentioned the interesting categorization or differential between the Sufi and the Salafis, right? I mean, many times you assume there is a strong correlation between varieties of Muslim thought and violent tendencies, where Salafism is often associated with intolerance and violence, and Sufism with the opposite, right? The tolerance and non-violence. And Salafism has basically become the boogeyman, and Sufism as the antidote. But your discussion or the pointers that you have mentioned earlier clearly shows that it is not necessarily black and white, right? I mean, it's not just like playing a game where in reality, Muslim or the actors, the choices or decisions of Muslim actors are complex and nuanced. Um, and it also shows that exclusionary thinking can exist the moment one see the world in binaries. It basically sets the stage for potential threat of hatred and violence, regardless of whether one is Salafi or not. Take, for example, the anti-Shiite sentiments or homophobia, anti-Semitism, and even Occidentalism, right, or anti-Western sentiments are apparent in both camps, and you can see that clearly in those who oppose Salafism in certain Facebook groups that you have highlighted in your paper. And to put the blame on one group would, I would say, be a form of misplaced responsibility, as it discounts historical and political realities that have shaped the complex nature of this of Muslim actors. So, having said all of that, right? What are your recommendations for those who are working on CBE policies, academics and activists who are strongly influenced by this oversimplification or misinformed differentiation? Yeah.
I think you might have answered my question for me somehow in your implication, but basically to reconsider, as academics, as policymakers, we are always supposed to reconsider uh, our own assumptions. Our studies are themselves always, you can disprove our studies in 5, 10 years time. In fact, if you don't agree with our journal article, you are very welcome to come up with your own framework and methodology, conduct research, and argue against us. The problem with being fixated on assumptions is that over time, some of these assumptions no longer become uh, applicable to reality. And when that happens, we end up, persecuting people, especially when it comes to issues related to security. We end up persecuting people who don't deserve to be persecuted. For example, there are Muslims in parts of the world who 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 suffer, I guess, or rather, they face a lot of difficulties as minorities because of assumptions about Muslims that were perhaps true at one point of time. For example, there could be a separatist group that defines this particular ethnicity and or religious sect. After a while, this separatist group does not is not around anymore. But anyway, they generalize and say, okay, everybody from this particular group needs to be of concern when put through camps and so on, re-education camps or whatever it is. There are a lot of these cases around the world. That's the first thing that academics and policymakers need to note about assumptions about not basically not reconsidering things, terms and conditions, and assuming that they are always going to be true for all of time and any time and place. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, you are alienating people who may be very useful to you. For example, if Singapore had treated all Salafis with the same broad stroke, that all of Salafism and all Salafis are a security problem to Singapore, we will lose out uh, a lot of helpful asatizas who may have been labeled as Salafis or themselves identify as Salafis, who have helped to teach the proper virtues and values of Islam to their followers and keep them from being, taking part in certain activities that leads to radicalism or violence and so on. So everybody is a partner. We are all together, or rather not me, but all the asatizas, that all of you are together working to advance our religion, so that for everybody's good and teaching the right values and so on. So if we were to only take these assumptions to be true, then we are no longer working together anymore, and it's not very helpful anymore. And the kind of conversations that we have between Salafis and non-Salafis, especially among the religious elite, the disagreements that you may have between the two of you actually help to clarify certain issues down the road. Maybe not theology, but perhaps in the field of jurisprudence, in the field of faith, how we practice Islam in our daily lives. There will be things that disagreements, how the disagreements will eventually lead to positive things. So, for example, disagreements between uh, uh, theology, even theologians, the Ash'ari, for example, represent for somewhat of a middle ground between Mu'tazila and Shia theology. And if those conversations are not held peaceably, because we are enemies and so on with each other, we don't see each other as Muslims, and then we won't have religious tradition that will be of use for our understanding, getting closer to God, and being good Muslims in our lives.
Farooq, I mean,
Yeah,
if I
sure.
can share, I think to put in like a contestation between like few groups or two groups, right? I think if you look at our history, we always see that in our history, or not only necessarily in Singapore, but also in this part of the world, like in Southeast Asia or even in the world. So you see, for example, when in the 1900s, when the Salafi came about, right? So they are being labeled as kaum muda, right? Because they are so-called like the new generation who so-called came in to so-called spoil the religious traditions that we have. So that's the contestation happened. And then after that, it evolved into some other terms. So like today, we often heard about Salafi and non-Salafi. Not only on a societal level, but also like on a global level, on a religious elite level. So, for example, if I can share about for example, about the Grosny conference, whereby scholars try to differentiate between who are the ahli sunnah and whatnot. So these contestations keeps happening, and all this group will argue from which angle they are from, and at the end of the day, as a community, I think our concern is more of whether these contestations affect us. Affect our social cohesion, you see, or our interaction between each other, or we become enemies and whatnot. So I think it's more, to cover on the CVAE part, right? So to me, it's more on, yes, we allow all these differences, right, in the community, and to what extent we allow this contestation. If the extent that you allow them to fight until even on a physical level and fight, and I think we should put a stop to it. Yeah, but because ideas need to evolve, right, in a community in terms of the discussion, discourse, and whatnot. So I think to allow certain difference in terms of idea is healthy for the community, but like to dominate, and to go to the extent to strongly reject people's idea, I think that shouldn't be the case. Yeah.
I mean, both of you rightly pointed out, and basically there are structural constraints that somewhat moderate these differences, if I can put it that way. Um, and let me just go back to Izhar's question, the second question that he has. Can we say that the historical development of Salafism as a political movement was a result of anti-imperialistic sentiments against the perceived decadence of the Ottoman Empire towards its fall? And speaking of imperialism, right? I would like to add on to that question. In the paper itself or in the discussion, you mentioned, or we can see the growth of Muhammadiyah as an organization, from an organization that shared the same position as modernist Salafis in the 20th century, to an organization that is, now linked to Wahhabi movements in Saudi Arabia. And that shift is particularly interesting. And you mentioned that this labeling the labeling of this shift is misinformed, and it is mainly due to the wrong intel by British intelligence officer. Could you, explain that further?
Okay. So based from our findings, right, that's where we found that, interestingly, that Muhammadiyah is being labeled Wahhabi because some intel officers claim that organization as a Wahhabi organization. That's why until today, even that organization is continued to be labeled as Wahhabi. But bear in mind though, like when we look at Muhammadiyah, even when we look at Dr. Khairuddin's Al-Junaid writing, right? So even he labeled Muhammadiyah as other Muhammadiyah, meaning it's like different from the Muhammadiyah in Indonesia. So, and then when we interviewed individuals from the Muhammadiyah, we also found out that actually within Muhammadiyah there are different type of, here I use it as the term Salafi broadly, which includes the modernists. So even Muhammadiyah included in that organization the modernists and also the Wahhabis. That's why if you look at the history of Muhammadiyah, or who knows about that organization, there'll be certain split that happen in their history. So during certain years, there'll be split, between the so-called the Salafis and modernists, and also the Salafi or the Wahhabis. So technically, I think in terms of label, yes. I mean, through our history, yes, Muhammadiyah was labeled as Salafi or Wahhabi organization, and it continues until today. But like I said, within the Muhammadiyah, there are different groups within that organization itself. So to label Muhammadiyah as Wahhabi alone, I think it would be unfair, because inside it there are also modernists. Yeah, yeah.
What about the question by Isha? I mean, did it basically evolve as a result of anti-imperialistic sentiments against the perceived decadence of the Ottoman Empire?
Okay, so if I can check, I think it's related to the questions that I answered earlier also. It's about uh, during that period, there are movements or groups who see that the decaying of Muslim is because of certain influence, certain factors of influence, external factors or even internal. So therefore, they need to somewhat change, so-called change the religion, and or to purify that religion into so-called a better or pure version of religion. So Haziq, if you want to share anything, Haziq.
Yeah, so that would be one strain of Salafism. But you will notice that Salafism has references that go even before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, even through medieval times. So um, we, if we want to do a historiography of Salafism, that means to trace the history of ideas, you can place certain ideas to certain contexts, uh, certain references to certain contexts, but it's not just because of uh, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. There's also aspects of Salafism that address modernity. So there are modernist Salafis who look at how Muslims aren't able to uh, practice their religion in a way that is that puts Muslims on par in terms of social and living standards as the same as non-Muslims. Uh, isn't that a constant that came about just because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire? Although a lot of the thinkers who argued about that were referring to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but I think that you don't need to go that far behind also to make that form of comparison. And some of them don't even need to do that. So they may, for example, just refer to look at the Muslim world right now. They are part of a majority of it is part of the global south. You know, when none of us are in categorized as first world countries, and therefore there is something very wrong uh, about our how our religion is being taught and practiced and so on. They will make the comparison and conclusion and come to the same argument or same outcome as well.
Mhm. Thanks, Azik. And you concluded the paper by arguing the experience of moderate Salafis. It simply shows that Salafis could perhaps develop their ideas while reflecting on the structural constraints that you have outlined earlier. Could you perhaps elaborate how are they able to express themselves with these constraints in mind, and what is the significance?
Okay. So the structural constraints that I am referring to is the context of living in Singapore. We are in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. So there will be ideas, Salafi or not, that are propounded by certain scholars elsewhere, and certain references in our religious resources that don't seem to be applicable to life in Singapore. And because of the securitization of Salafism, uh, of course, there are negative outcomes, but the positive outcome is that Salafis are confident in their belief, and they are confident to know that their belief does not make them uh, outcast in this society. That means I can, for example, if I was a Salafi, I'm confident that I can practice my religion in Singapore. There is no problems day to day. Yeah, you know, I can pray. I can have certain ideas, and those ideas fit within our context. So this development, of course, will we'll continue we'll continue in the future history of Salafism. So depends on what new challenges uh, w- we will face. Not just Salafis, but even non-Salafis as well.
Mhm. Okay. And before we conclude, right, what are some potential areas for research for those who are interested in studying Salafism in Singapore or the region?
Yeah, actually, Farouk, if you know of any, you should let us know so then we can keep our jobs. Yeah. But one of the areas of research that is still yet to be studied is Salafis who are considered lay Salafis. That means Salafis who are not really scholars, but they are very strong in their beliefs and advocates for their beliefs. People haven't really studied that. There are also Salafis who are on social media platforms who are not technically asatizas, who are sharing their views. And their form of Salafism may be slightly different from the Salafism that is being taught by our asatizas. And this difference, this nuance itself is a new category that no one has looked at before. So if anybody is interested to work with us on researching this aspect of Salafism as practiced and as viewed by lay Salafis, then you can contact us and we can work together. And if you have any differences of opinions as well, we can always work together and advance our research. Yeah.
Hmm. And any like final words. I mean, I don't like the term final words, but maybe like words to clarify certain confusion, or to clarify certain misconception on what you are trying to present from the both of
Yeah, I
you.
think on my end, at least, I mean, me and Huzaifa both agree that if, let's say, you went through our paper and you went through our presentation, and you feel that we are attacking Salafism, and
Mm.
you feel that we are painting Salafism in a particular way, then I think you have got our arguments wrong, and maybe
Mm.
we did not present it in a way that is clear to you. Uh, but what we actually trying to understand are the different strains of Salafism in Singapore now, as practiced by Salafis now, at least in 2015 to 2017 when we were doing the paper. And we are the labels that we put on to explain certain behaviors and so on. They are not meant as they're not permanent. People change of their views over time, sometimes within a year, but our paper was written in a few years back. And of course, some of these things will no longer apply. For example, authorities may have intervened, and some of these writings have been taken down, and so on and so forth. So, our research is not done just because we published the journal article, and perhaps we will come up with updates in the future when it's
Mm.
relevant to present to the academia and to the public.
Okay, so for me, I would say that the terms, the discussion, the labels that we use in our paper, it's not that we, pick it out of thin air. No, we use scholarly works. So we cannot define Salafism as how we want or
Mhm.
how the society wants. So it's all based on a scholarly works. And then from there on, we try to develop it further and try to fit it within the framework of our paper. So, because often they're not, when people see or heard about this Salafism, right? People always think, oh, who are the Salafi? Who are the Wahhabi? So even when we try to use, for example, if like just now I try to say, oh, Muhammadiyah is a Wahhabi organization, right? Based on the report by the British intelligence, then people would say, oh, dear, see, Muhammadiyah is a Wahhabi organization. So it's not as simple as that to just label or to use the label for organization, for even individuals. So our work is based on scholarly works that we use, and we try to, uh, look at that from a really rigorous academic work or reading, and try to write it along the in a scholarly way lah, to put it, so that people can understand it better, rather than it becomes like a coffee shop talk kind of a paper or discussion. So I think that's where our efforts, we try to put it in that sense. So whatever labels, I would say, is based on somebody else's works that we develop further, and then we try to put it in a, in the current context of Singapore, or Salafis in Singapore. Yeah, and of course, like Haziq mentioned, the research hasn't stopped. I mean, we still continue. We try to look at some other areas also. Like for example, when we started with these Salafi topics, we want to know who in Singapore can give us a substantive answer or a substantive argument about what do you mean by Salafi or Salafi or Salafism. So that's why we pick these 10 individuals. Of course, if we want to extend these interviews to, like, for example, even lay person, we may find different ideas, different answers. And I think although it may not be accurate, but it can be helpful in understanding the Salafi landscape in Singapore. So for instance, when we talk about the discourse, right, in our presentation, so one of it will be between Tauhid 3 and Sifat 20, right? The Usul Salasa and also the Sifat 20. So I have a few of my who I am close with shared with me that I don't want to learn this Sifat 20 because it's too philosophical for me. And he's a non-Salafi. He would say he follow the Shafi and whatnot. So he would think that I think studying this Tauhid 3 is better for me because it's easy for me to digest compared to learning Sifat 20. So you see, this kind of idea gives you a different perspective about so meaning what? Can we label him as a Salafi? That kind of thing. So I think it's not conclusive yet. I mean, it's still under. We are still looking at it and researching on it. Like how do we actually identify then? For this segment of our Muslim community and whatnot. Yeah.
Thank you, Sir Zaifa and Mr. Haziq. But before I end, right, there's someone here who asked, may I know where we can get access to the full research paper? Can you help us with that?
Okay.
Okay, so
Haziq, you have to, unmute your microphone.
sorry.
No
The age
worries.
of Zoom and the awkwardness of not unmuting the microphone. But anyway, the paper is available online. So if you do a quick search contemporary Salafism in Singapore, you will see it on Taylor and Francis online. But if you do not have access, perhaps because there's a paywall, you have to be part of a library and so on. You can try the National Library if their proxy access works. Otherwise, you can always look us up on the RSIS website. You can drop us an email and I feel afraid of saying this. Drop us an email and request the link, and we'll provide a readable copy for you. Yeah,
No strings attached, yeah?
yeah, no strings attached.
Thank you, Huzaifa. Thank you, Haziq, for that insightful discussion. I guess just to reiterate the point, this is not an attempt to pit one group against the other. I mean, if you see it that way, then probably you have not read the paper well or the discussion. I invite you to, look at the presentation again and then suspend your judgment. In fact, what we are trying to do is to understand the nuances within this movement and to check our confirmation biases and to expand our knowledge of certain things. And if let's say you feel attacked, I mean, we would like to apologize I would like to apologize on behalf of RIMA, but this is a research paper. This is an academic paper, and just like any academic paper, it has limitations. It is not the final say. You are welcome to challenge it academically, you're welcome to counter the paper. That is, I think, the purpose of having this discussion in the first place. And it is to acknowledge the diversity that we have, and to ensure wherever we are, that the social fabric of our country, our nation, is being protected from any binary thinking or exclusionary thinking. I think that is very important. So with that, we have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you again, Haziq and Huzaifa, and our viewers for joining us. We hope that you have found this session insightful and leave with useful takeaways. Do follow Rima on our social media platforms. We are not just on Facebook. We are also young, and we are on Instagram and hopefully TikTok, but I'm not sure about that. But do check out our social media platforms to be abreast with our upcoming programs. In fact, we'll be posting our upcoming webinar and report on food delivery riders very soon. In fact, it is on the 29th of December, at the end of this month, and that will be a blast, hopefully, inshallah. So thank you again for tuning in. Have a good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.